I want to start with a number. 3,400. That's how many kilometers of hand-dug irrigation tunnels have been mapped beneath what is now the Libyan Sahara. Underground channels carved through solid bedrock by a civilization that the official historical record describes consistently as nomadic, as raiders, as a people without fixed settlements, without cities, without agriculture. 3,400 kilometers of precision-engineered water infrastructure, moving fossil aquifer water horizontally through solid rock to surface-fed grain fields in a desert over 1,000 years ago. And then I want to add a second number, 0. That is how many school textbooks mention this at any meaningful length. 0 mainstream documentaries have centered this story, 0. Hold those two numbers together because I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes asking a very simple question that the historians, the archaeologists, the climate scientists publishing in their peer-reviewed journals have never quite answered to my satisfaction. Not what happened to the grain fields of the Sahara. That's actually documented in fragments, if you know where to look. Not when they disappeared, not even how. The question I want to ask is the one hiding underneath all those other questions. Why does a civilization capable of engineering 3,400 kilometers of underground irrigation not exist, by name, in the story of human history that every schoolchild on Earth is taught? About 4 years ago, I started looking into something I initially thought was a footnote, a regional archaeological curiosity. The kind of discovery that gets a brief mention in an academic journal and then disappears from public discourse entirely. I was reading about the Garamantes, a people who inhabited the Fezzan region of what is now southwestern Libya from roughly 500 BCE to 700 CE. In every mainstream treatment of this civilization, if they're mentioned at all, the description is consistent. Desert dwellers, raiders, a minor regional presence, people who scraped existence from an inhospitable landscape and eventually declined into irrelevance. That is the official picture. And then I found the foggaras. Foggara is the Arabic term for what engineers would call a kana, a horizontal underground channel designed to intercept the water table in elevated terrain and carry it by gravity alone through tunnels carved through solid rock to agricultural land at lower elevation. The technology is sophisticated. It requires precise topographical understanding, geological knowledge of aquifer location, and the organizational capacity to coordinate labor across enormous distances and across generations. The system cannot be built by raiders. It cannot be maintained by nomads. It requires settled communities with inherited institutional memory, communities that expect to be in the same place long enough for children to finish what their grandparents began. What the archaeological surveys conducted by British researcher Charles Daniels and later expanded by Italian and Libyan teams in the late 20th century revealed was this. The Garamantian foggara system covered the entire Fezzan Basin, thousands of shafts, some descending more than 15 meters to the water table, connected by horizontal tunnels running for kilometers at a time, surfacing at carefully positioned agricultural plots distributed across the landscape. The total mapped extent of the system, 3,400 kilometers. And here's what the official story doesn't fully reckon with. This infrastructure was not built in response to desert conditions as a desperate survival measure. It was built in response to a landscape that was already drying to maintain agricultural productivity in a system that had existed by the stratigraphic evidence for far longer than the Garamantian political period. The deeper question is not who built the foggaras. The deeper question is what they were maintaining. Let me give you a number that changes the frame entirely. 11,000. That is the approximate number of years before the present that the African Humid Period, what climate scientists call the Green Sahara, began. For roughly 6,000 years, from about 11,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It was a mosaic of lakes, rivers, grasslands and forest systems covering an area larger than the continental United States. The evidence is everywhere once you know to look for it. Lakebed sediments in the middle of the current desert, fossilized river channels visible from satellite imagery, fish bones and freshwater shellfish middens found hundreds of kilometers from any current water source, and the rock art. At Tassili Najjar in Algeria, at Wadi Sura in Egypt, at dozens of smaller sites scattered across what is now barren rock and sand, there are paintings and engravings dating back 8, 9, 10,000 years. They show cattle grazing in grasslands, they show hippopotamuses in rivers, they show people swimming, fishing, harvesting. They show a landscape so profoundly unlike the current Sahara that the first European explorers who encountered these images in the 19th century struggled to believe they were looking at the same geography they were standing in. This is in the mainstream record. The African Humid Period is not disputed. The rock art is not disputed. The paleo-ecological data is not disputed. What is almost never asked in any mainstream context is the question that logically follows from all of it. If the Sahara was green and productive for 6,000 years, and if human populations inhabited and utilized that landscape across that entire period, what did they build? What did they grow? What food systems did they develop and maintain across 60 centuries of inhabitable terrain? And where did those systems go? The official explanation is straightforward. The African Humid Period ended due to orbital forcing, a slow shift in Earth's axial tilt and orbital parameters that reduced monsoon penetration into North Africa. The vegetation dried, the lakes receded. The populations that had depended on that landscape either migrated toward the Nile Valley and the nascent civilizations of the Fertile Crescent, or they adapted to increasingly arid conditions using increasingly sophisticated water management. Like, for instance, 3,400 kilometers of underground irrigation channels. That explanation is technically accurate as far as it goes, but the deeper I went, the more that explanation began to feel like a frame around a much larger picture. A frame designed to direct your attention toward the climate mechanism and away from what is sitting just outside the edge of it. Because here's what the official story doesn't fully reckon with. The transition from the Green Sahara to the current desert was not instantaneous. It was gradual, regional, and in many areas extraordinarily prolonged. Paleo-ecological data from the Central Sahara suggests that productive food-supporting landscapes persisted in isolated zones for thousands of years after the main humid period ended. The Fezzan Basin had productive groundwater-fed agriculture into the 7th century CE. The Tibesti Highlands retained montane vegetation until medieval times. The Hoggar Massif had springs and marshes documented by Tuareg oral history into the 19th century. What this means when you sit with it is that the productive landscape of what is now the Sahara did not simply evaporate with the orbital cycle. It persisted, in pockets, in river valleys, in highland systems, maintained in many cases by active human management for thousands of years after the climate officially became hostile. And in those pockets, something was happening that the mainstream record has never quite organized into a coherent picture. There was grain, not wheat or barley in the European sense, but the native African cereals that developed across the Saharan margins over millennia of deliberate cultivation. Sorghum, pearl millet, fonio. And here is where the botany becomes interesting, because the domestication timeline for these crops, when you look at the archaeobotanical record carefully, points not toward the Nile or the Fertile Crescent, but toward the Central Sahara, toward the same zones that the Green Sahara data shows were inhabited and productive for thousands of years before those crops appear in the record of Egypt or the Levant. The current consensus places the domestication of pearl millet somewhere near the Sahel-Sahara boundary, around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. But recent work at sites in the Libyan Fezzan and in Niger's Air Mountains has pushed evidence for managed wild millet harvesting considerably further back. And here is the thing about managed wild harvesting. Once you can distinguish it archaeologically from casual foraging, through seed size, through storage facility presence, through the distribution of processing tools, what you're looking at is agriculture. Not proto-agriculture, not incipient food production. A functioning, organized, geographically distributed system of grain cultivation in the middle of what is now one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you're finding this investigation worth following, consider subscribing. What's coming in the next 15 minutes is where this story stops being a regional archaeological puzzle and becomes something considerably harder to explain away. I want to talk about Carthage. Carthage is always described in a particular way: a trading empire, a maritime power, a civilization defined by commerce, sea routes and conflict with Rome, and all of that is true. But there is something else about Carthage that doesn't receive proportionate attention in the story we tell about it. Carthage was fed by an agricultural system of extraordinary productivity. The territories under Carthaginian influence across North Africa were, by every ancient account, among the most fertile lands in the known world. Roman writers describing the Punic agricultural texts refer repeatedly to a writer named Mago. 28 volumes of agronomic work considered so significant that the Roman Senate ordered them translated into Latin after the destruction of Carthage, even as they burned essentially every other Punic document they could find. Let that sit for a moment. Rome destroyed Carthage so completely that the city's very site was salted in the most thorough act of cultural erasure the ancient Mediterranean world had produced. And yet the agricultural texts they preserved, the books about farming they saved while burning everything else. This raises a simple but critical question. What was in those books? Mago's work does not survive. The translation was made, used by Roman agricultural writers for several centuries, and then disappeared. What we know of its contents comes entirely from those citations, which describe crop rotation systems, soil management techniques, water harvesting approaches, and what one Roman author describes as methods for maintaining permanent productive tree crops in conditions of uncertain rainfall. Permanent productive tree crops in North Africa, across conditions of uncertain rainfall. Food forests. Not that term, not in the Latin, but structurally, functionally, the thing those citations describe is a managed perennial food system adapted to a semi-arid landscape. The same category of system that appears in the record of indigenous Australia. The same category that appears in the pre-enclosure commons of England, in the forest gardens of the Amazon basin. Precisely the category of food production that generates yield without requiring external inputs, without requiring ownership in the European legal sense, without requiring participation in a controlled economic structure. And precisely the category of food system that seems to vanish from the historical record with a consistency I find increasingly difficult to describe as coincidence. Carthage was destroyed in 146 BCE. Its agricultural territories fell under Roman administration, and within 2 generations those same territories were producing, according to Roman administrative records, approximately 1 million tons of grain annually for the city of Rome. Not for Carthage, not for the indigenous North African populations who had farmed those fields across centuries of independent civilization. For Rome, within 2 generations, the same land, different output, different destination, different beneficiary, and a completely different relationship between the people who worked the soil and the people who received its yield. Under Roman administration, the agricultural surplus of North Africa moved through a system of centralized extraction. The people who farmed those fields after 146 BCE needed Roman permission, Roman land tenure structures, Roman legal instruments to do so. The food that had sustained North African civilizations for centuries began feeding an empire those civilizations had not built and did not control. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Let me go further back. Because the Saharan story does not begin with Carthage. Carthage is, in the timeline I'm tracing, almost a recent chapter. The cattle pastoralists of the Saharan Neolithic, documented in rock art from the Fezzan to the Red Sea Hills, were not simple wanderers following grass. The distribution of their sites, the evidence of their encampments, the botanical assemblages that include both wild harvested and managed plant species, point toward a population that understood the landscape with the kind of precision you develop across thousands of years of deliberate cultivation. There are species distributions in the Hoggar and Air massifs, ancient fig trees and wild olive specimens clustering around former settlement sites and ancient water sources that do not look random. They look selected. They look, if you were willing to follow where the evidence takes you, planted. And there is a body of medieval Arabic geographical writing that has never received the mainstream attention it deserves. Geographers like al-Bakri, writing in the 11th century, al-Idrisi in the 12th, Ibn Battuta in the 14th. These writers describe trans-Saharan routes passing through productive stopping points, oases with established tree cover, established grain storage, established water systems with a consistency that suggests infrastructure rather than accident. Al-Idrisi's geographical compendium describes areas of the central Sahara that modern surveys record as absolute desert as containing, in his own observation, sources of water, trees producing edible fruit, and communities maintaining grain stores across seasons. The language is matter of fact. He is not describing wonders, he is describing ordinary infrastructure. By the time European colonial mapping expeditions reached the Saharan interior in the 19th century, that infrastructure was gone. The oasis systems that remained were degraded remnants, the tree cover was fragmented, the water systems were failing, and the official explanation, given then as now, is that the desert had advanced, climate, aridity, the relentless expansion of sand. But here's what stays with me. The German explorer Heinrich Barth, travelling through the Fezzan and across to Lake Chad between 1850 and 1855, documented the surviving remnants of the Garamantian foggara system in the most detailed field notes produced by any 19th century Saharan explorer. And he documented something else. In area after area where local populations still maintained partial access to ancient water infrastructure, where old channels had been partially kept, and old agricultural plots had not been fully abandoned, there was food. Dates, yes, but also sorghum, millet, legumes, and in several cases fruit trees of apparent great age in arrangements that Barth himself describes as suggesting former cultivation of considerable extent. Barth was not a speculative thinker. He was a rigorous German academic who died before he could fully publish his findings. But the pattern in his notes, the recurring description of ancient productivity maintained in reduced form by populations who clearly remembered more extensive systems, is impossible to read without recognizing it for what it is. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. In the 16th century, when Ottoman administration extended across North Africa, the legal instruments applied to Saharan land should sound familiar to anyone who has followed this research across other regions. Productive communal land, the oasis systems, the agricultural plots maintained by Berber and Tuareg communities through surviving ancient infrastructure, was reclassified under Miri land categories. State land, eligible for grant to approved holders. The same mechanism that appeared in England's Enclosure Acts, in France's reorganisation of the Forêt domaniale, in Australia's Crown Lands Acts of the 1860s. The redefinition of communally managed productive land as state property. The same compressed window of claiming, the same result, enclosure. And then the French arrived in the Algerian Sahara in force in the 1840s and extended into the Fezzan through the early 20th century. What they found was described in colonial reports in a very specific way. Marginal land, subsistence agriculture, primitive water management. The same vocabulary applied to Australia's managed food forests. The same vocabulary applied to the pre-enclosure commons of England. The same vocabulary applied to the forest gardens of West Africa. Wherever the documentation needs the land to appear poor before the claiming begins, it finds it poor. But here's what the colonial era surveys actually measured. In the Fezzan oases in the 1920s, French administrators recorded date palm plantations of considerable extent, grain cultivation under existing foggara irrigation, and fruit production sufficient to sustain local populations without external food imports. Not poverty, production. And then the survey records what happens to that production within 2 administrative generations. The foggara maintenance falters because the communal labour obligations rooted in Garamantian-derived water law are disrupted by colonial taxation policy that pulls labour into wage work. The date palm plantations are mapped, registered and transferred through legal mechanisms that local communities are not equipped to challenge in French administrative courts. The grain cultivation contracts to a fraction of its former extent because the water infrastructure it depended on is no longer being collectively maintained. By independence, what had been documented in 1920 as viable production landscapes was documented in the 1960s as degraded remnant. That is how a food system disappears in the official record, not by fire, not by a single dramatic act, by the administrative disruption of the maintenance systems that kept it functional, change the labour law, disrupt the communal water rights, wait 2 generations, survey again, document what you find, which is poverty, which is subsistence, which is marginal land that looks nothing like what the earlier survey recorded, and file the earlier survey in a colonial archive in Paris, uncross-referenced with the record that follows it. The silence was deafening. I looked for a comprehensive analysis of what the pre-colonial Saharan food system actually was, not a climate reconstruction, not a paleo-ecological assessment of which plant species existed, a food systems analysis, what was growing where, who was managing it, what was being eaten and traded and stored, the kind of analysis that exists in reasonable form for medieval European agriculture, for ancient Chinese grain systems, for pre-Columbian Mesoamerican food production. It doesn't exist, not in any consolidated form. The information is scattered across Arabic geographical texts, incompletely translated, across colonial expedition notes inconsistently archived, across oral histories of Tuareg and Tubu communities sporadically recorded and almost never synthesized, across archaeobotanical papers addressing single sites in journals that don't cross-reference each other. The information exists in fragments. The synthesis has never been seriously attempted. And I keep asking myself, why? Here is where the coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. For the erasure of the Sahara's food system to have been a series of independent regional events, organic developments of unrelated historical processes, the following would have to be simultaneously true. The Roman destruction of Carthaginian agricultural autonomy and the redirection of North African grain surplus would have to be unrelated to the later Ottoman reclassification of communal Saharan land under Miri categories, which would have to be unrelated to the French colonial disruption of Garamantian-derived water law in the Fezzan, which would have to be unrelated to the classification of Nubian aquifer survey data as strategically sensitive in the 1950s, which would have to be unrelated to what happened in 2011. In 2011, NATO forces conducting operations against Muammar Gaddafi's government struck the manufacturing and maintenance facility for the Great Man-Made River project, the largest infrastructure project in Libyan history, a network of pipelines drawing from the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, the largest fossil water reserve on Earth, and delivering that ancient water to Libyan agricultural land. The facility that was hit was not a command centre. It was not a weapons depot. It was the installation that maintained the pipes delivering Saharan groundwater to farms. It was a water pipe factory. I'm not going to tell you what that means. I'm going to leave that data point exactly where it sits. These would all have to be independent events separated by centuries, occurring in overlapping geographies, producing across 2,000 years of separate local explanations the identical outcome. Less autonomous food production, more centralized control, the people working the land after each transition needing someone else's permission to access the water, the soil, the legal framework to farm it. The official explanation collapses here, not because any single event is inexplicable on its own terms, but because the shape of what's missing across all of them is uniform. Across Roman administrative records, across Ottoman land registries, across French colonial surveys, across modern archaeological site access restrictions, the same specific category of information is absent: pre-claiming food productivity, pre-enclosure community land use, pre-extraction water system function. That particular category uniformly missing across jurisdictions with entirely different archival traditions and entirely different political histories. That kind of absence is not accident. That kind of absence is architecture. Here is the thing I find most difficult to set aside when I follow this research to its end. The Nubian Sandstone Aquifer system is the largest known fossil water reserve on Earth. It underlies approximately 2 million square kilometers of northeastern Africa, beneath Libya, Egypt, Sudan, and Chad. It holds an estimated 150,000 cubic kilometers of ancient water, accumulated during the 6,000 years when monsoon rainfall crossed the Green Sahara. It is the remnant of the water system that made everything I've described in this video possible. It is the stored inheritance of the civilization the official record says never existed. That water is currently being extracted on all four sides of its extent by agricultural and industrial projects at a rate that most hydrological projections suggest will exhaust recoverable reserves within 2 centuries. The people conducting those extractions have known those projections since the first comprehensive aquifer surveys in the 1950s. I want to close with a question I genuinely cannot answer. What did they know? Not the Roman administrators with their land grants, not the Ottoman clerks with their Miri reclassifications, not the French colonial surveyors describing marginal land in territories that 20 years of prior records had documented as productive. What did whoever designed those systems across 2,000 years and separate institutions and separate languages know about what was being erased? Because here's the thing about the knowledge that lived in the Sahara's food system. The knowledge of where to dig a foggara shaft, how deep before the water table, which gradient to hold through solid rock across 5 kilometers of tunnel, when to plant which grain in which microclimate, which tree species to establish near which water source. That knowledge didn't live in texts, it lived in communities, in the people who maintained the shafts, in the families whose inheritance was a section of channel requiring seasonal clearing, in the ceremonies organized around the grain harvest that al-Idrisi recorded as ordinary infrastructure and that are now remembered in fragments by communities that have not been permitted to farm with those systems for 200 years. When the communities were disrupted, when the labor systems were restructured, when the water rights were reclassified, that knowledge did not transfer to archives in Paris or Rome or Istanbul. It contracted. It diminished with each generation that couldn't practice it. Some of it is being reconstructed by researchers working with Tuareg and Tubu communities, carefully and against significant institutional resistance. But the depth of what existed, the full operational knowledge of a food system that maintained grain production across 10,000 years of climate transition, may be for all practical purposes irretrievable. The system is gone. The instructions are gone. And what replaced it is a structure of food and water access that is by every measurable metric less resilient, less diverse, less autonomous, and more dependent than what it replaced. The foggara shafts are still visible from satellite. Barth's field notes exist in a German university library if you know to ask for them. The citations of Mago's agricultural texts survive in Columella and Pliny, the outline of a system Rome preserved in excerpt and then allowed to disappear. Al-Idrisi describes water and fruit trees in places the modern map marks as uninhabitable. The evidence is there in fragments scattered across disciplines that do not talk to each other, siloed into archaeobotany and climate science and medieval Islamic geography and colonial administrative history, almost never brought together into a coherent picture. Almost never. What I know is that 3,400 kilometers of hand-dug irrigation tunnels exist beneath the Libyan desert, built by a civilization the official record calls primitive. What I know is that the water they accessed sits in the world's largest fossil aquifer, currently being drawn down at a rate its managers have understood since the 1950s. What I know is that Mago's 28 volumes describing North African food system management was saved through the destruction of everything else Carthaginian and then lost. What I know is that Al-Idrisi described food production across the central Sahara in areas that European maps 2 centuries later recorded as barren. What I know is that the synthesis of this evidence, the coherent picture of what the Sahara's food system was before Rome, before the Ottomans, before the French, before the current extraction regime, has never been seriously assembled. And I know that what replaced it requires your money, your labour, your participation in a system of food and water access that you did not design and do not control. Those are the facts. The question of who understood what was being erased and when remains in the official record almost entirely unasked. And the silence, when you start listening for it, is deafening.